Startups without a story just don't start up. Startups, by definition, run on stories. And startup founders have to persuade three types of people. They have to persuade customers, get some sort of trajectory. They have to persuade a team. They have to get talent to come on board. And they have to persuade investors. That's just part of the thing. So these three target audiences are only persuaded by stories, because the story is, imagine what we can make together. Imagine what your life would be better, how your life would be as a customer with our product. Imagine buying into this company and what we can build together. And then to investors, it's invest in us. Imagine what we, again, can build together. Now, there are lots of great stories about phenomenal startups. There is Tesla, which really doesn't talk about cars. They talk about the environment and low emissions or zero emissions. Apple talks about simplicity of use and person-focused technology. Amazon talks about the customer, focusing on the customer rather than focusing on their competitors. Nike doesn't sell shoes. Nike sells the dream, the just do it. How many stories, how many millions of personal stories has that slogan started, triggered, and carried on? Think of all of those startups. But I'll tell you about another startup. I worked for this startup 20 odd years after it had started. Now, this startup at that stage was quite successful. It had hundreds and hundreds of people. It worked in one building in Waldorf in Germany, south of Heidelberg, and it was called SAP. It still is. Now, SAP in its beginning was 5 men who left IBM in 1972. They left great jobs at IBM, can you imagine, and started up this company in a 2-bedroom flat in Heidelberg. So what was their story? At that stage, within a company, if you had a sales order come in, it then went to a production facility. And that was a paper transaction. And that transaction was then changed into a purchasing transaction, which then went out to customers, to suppliers. And this whole thing took ages. And the premise at the beginning of SAP, or the story that was often told to me and that we used a lot, was that imagine what it would be like if as soon as the order came in, it triggered the production order automatically. It triggered the change in inventory automatically. It triggered an order to suppliers instantly. Imagine how much more efficient we would be. Imagine how much faster the customer would get the product. Imagine how much more efficient our stock levels could be. Now, that was a story because they were just talking about imagine what we could do, imagine what you could do, imagine what your business could do. The other great thing about stories, in all of these companies, Apple, Tesla, Nike, Amazon, all of those companies, and I must confess to being an Airbnb user, and that's another great startup, an Apple user, I'm a massive fan of Amazon to my cost, but all of these startups, with their stories, they build tribes. And those tribes, those communities become intensely loyal. And those tribes are what keeps the company's trajectory going and builds their growth. Now, SAP was very, very focused on who their tribe was going to be. If you went to SAP as a company and wanted to try out their products, they weren't interested unless you were one of the following groups. They first focused on the DAX 100. This is the top 100 listed companies on the German Stock Exchange. They weren't on the German Stock Exchange there themselves at the time. They joined in about 93 or 94. I was there when it joined. It was a big party. But they only focused on the big companies. Then they focused on the FTSE 100 in the UK. And they focused on the top 100 companies in the USA. That was their initial tribe. That was their first 300 targets. And everything was focused on building that tribe with their stories. That single building in Waldorf, there's now 4 or 5 big buildings, all SAP buildings. That startup started with a story, and the story of that startup is just phenomenal. One of these days, I'll tell you about the story about the most expensive Porsche in the world, which is another SAP story. A fantastic story that's part of their culture and a great story to tell. Thank you.